if given the example, say, what would a school have to do? Because we know that there's all these ethics things, there's all, you know, the legalities of everything, but what would a school have to do, say if they said, oh, our bus costs are costing this amount, we live near the school, parents outside of even, you know, looking at, you know, liability or whatever, they say, you know, I think we're gonna run our own carpool system, and we want to use that so that we can do instructional days. How could you even start to address those kinds of things in the system that we have now?
Actually, I can start. Things like the bus and cafeteria services are paid centrally, so schools don't have to worry about those expenses, but then on the other hand, they can't also decide how to use those funds. Bus transportation may be a bad thing to bring up because we're looking at about a it's either 17 or $27 million shortfall this year. I know there's a 7 in there. And that's something that we have not addressed yet. So we're looking at how to address further shortfalls within the department. But in answer to your question, the schools do have their authority within their weighted student formula budget and other pots of money to make those kinds of decisions. But the bigger...
They can do, I thought you just said they couldn't.
The bigger costs, things like student transportation and cafeteria services, are centralized. So those, they do not have control over.
Could you tell me some of those centralized controlled costs, and would we be able to get a list of that? Okay. Can you name some examples of the biggest ones?
Student transportation and food. Student
utilities.
Facilities.
Utilities.
I'm sorry, but student transportation, utilities, our special education services, all the repair and maintenance, many of the essential services, which include the lawn mowing of the yards and all of that, come from a central thing. In relationship to the student transportation, you know, we contract buses, and so there are legal there are also legal implications because we already have a contract for a set number of dollars. We can't just say we're not going to use the bus anymore and breach the contract because that'll put us in harm's way in relationship to liabilities. So there's a lot of business decisions that go along with many of the contracts that we already have.
Now, what about programs? What kind of programs did you decide to cut? Because I'm sure you had to cut some programs. Well, maybe we can start by just naming some programs like that we have, you know, and just basically, because what I want to do is have some idea of like where were the priorities before we did the furlough days. And so I know that there's, I think, just a bunch of different programs, and I don't have a list in front of me, so I don't know where to start. But could we name some programs and then just say, you know, we kept this because?
Well, you know, Representative Finnegan, let me look, you know, suggest another way. We have X number of dollars. This year we started with a $200 million debt that started off with a restriction. And so given what we had, we did the best we could. So maybe my question to everyone in the room is, so why did we get cut the dollars and then we're expected to defend how we used what we got? Maybe I should be asking, couldn't you have given us more money to begin with so we wouldn't have had to cut programs?
Because, well, I can't answer for the whole state legislature or all of our constituents or anything like that. But I would say that like any other department and like any other household in this state that needs to cut back, it's a fact right now because of the economy. But it is, I think, your responsibility as the board and the Department of Education and everyone else in the Department of Education to take a look at these things and be able to provide answers to...
Is there an assumption that we haven't been doing that?
No, not at all. I'm trying to find out the information so that I can explain it to my constituents.
Representative Finnegan, if I may.
Yes.
Some of the cuts were made on teachers, probationary teachers. Hundreds of probationary teachers were not hired in this cuts. There were several cuts made through the Department of Education before we came to the decision of the 17 furlough days. If you remember, early on, it was the governor who wanted 36 days, furlough days. Okay. So 36 furlough days would have, in turn, taken some of the days that are waiver days and vacation days. But it's
Can I-
now 17
yes.
days.
I also just, what parts of the contract can and you cannot talk about, but just out of curiosity.
In regards to the cuts, okay, I don't know what specific programs, but I can talk about the impact to our membership.
Yes.
In September of last year, the governor asked all executive branches to submit budgetary plans for a 10, 15, and 20% budgetary reduction. Okay, and that was for this fiscal year that she was planning to cut. Now, the DOE came up with something like 14%. But that impacted 266 positions. Okay, and from that, a lot of our teachers who were on a 12-month work schedule lost their positions. Then they had to then go back to a 10-month position, okay, be it in the school and or in a different office. But basically, our membership has suffered multiple casualties from these budgetary restrictions, and they continue to do so.
And I totally respect the fact that you know, the teachers are going through a very hard time right now, and I understand that. But I do have to ask the question: probationary teachers. You know, we were talking about. Do you have to be excused? Is it?
No, I actually have our budget person here that can give you the chronology.
Okay.
And she's got the details, which I think will give you the programs that
Okay.
you're asking for.
And I'll try to keep this really short. But you know, when we're talking about priorities and furloughs and all of these things, to me, and help explain this to me, but to me, probationary teachers shouldn't have had the just, we're going to cut probationary teachers, you know, because it's not the probation part that is the category in which you cut. It's what's going to provide the schooling, the instruction to those kids. And if they're the classroom teachers and you cut them, I think that's a wrong decision.
But in that regard, as you folks know, because you folks passed Act 51, you delegated all that responsibility to the schools. They have to then produce their academic financial plan. They have to see where their budgetary resources is to fill these positions. You folks have made some cuts to these funding. Therefore, schools have less money to operate. They cannot operate, again, as the status quo model. It just continues to compound. It takes money to operate and properly educate our children.
Yes, and this is where I would just go, and this is the last, the food for thought, okay? The weighted student formula, from what I have studied, and I'm not going to say that I represent everybody in this room on the weighted student formula, from what I have studied, is that you don't have that money being connected so tightly to spend in a certain way, that eventually it comes down in lump sum spending so that the kids and not the kids, but the school communities can choose what's priority for them. But if they're at the school level with all of these restrictions on how they're going to spend the money, yes, you're right, they have no other choices. So it's not necessarily the tool of the weighted student formula that is wrong in the reform part of education, but I definitely think the stagnation of the weighted student formula moving forward and giving the schools lump sum funding so that they can keep their priority programs at their schools is a problem.